Okay, I've waited for the masking fluid to dry completely. I take my white flat brush again and I'll be wetting the paper for the first wash. Note that I try to wet the paper below the horizon line that I had marked in the distance, and I try to avoid going above it. It's not that critical in this work, but it's best if we don't touch the upper part for now. If you worry that you won't be able to go along this line evenly, you can cover it with masking tape. But you need to stick it very carefully and very firmly. If you know that your masking tape leaks, you better not use it. Next, I take a small flat brush and I apply the first blue wash. The color I use here is Verditer Blue and Cerulean by Mijello. It's well visible in the reference that the color in the distance is a beautiful sky blue. You can also use horizon blue there. I'll use my rubber to create a slight incline of the board. I'll remind you that in this work, I'm also using a plastic drawing board. It shouldn't be chipboard. I use that for the working space, but I usually paint on plastic drawing boards or plexiglass ones. Next, I add more ultramarine to this mix. It slightly darkens the tone because the background is a bit lighter than the middle ground. I apply this ultramarine to the middle part of the sheet. You see, we probably should have used masking fluid on the group of the stones on the left. Now I have to act more carefully. I add more cerulean. And I apply these strokes in the shape of waves. For now, they're just the first outlines of waves. In the future process of wave modeling, the soul should change, kind of get adjusted. And now I need to set the general tone for the foreground. It will be ochre. I don't have ochre here, so I mix this color myself. I use orange, Naples yellow, and add a bit of my secret color, shell pink, but actually it's not essential here. It just adds more opacity to my wash because it contains white pigment. This color is actually quite universal and beautiful. In the foreground, I try to add more Payne's Gray and ultramarine to this mix in order to add tone and darken it. I use the same mix to cover the waves in the shadow where the stones peep. Remember the exercise? We remember that we see the stones clearly through the shadow part of the waves. So I apply this ochre mix in horizontal strokes and I try to cover the paper partially and leave out these blue lines of the first color that we had added using cerulean to show the reflected sky. Just like in the first work, in this work it's important that the sky is reflected in the waves and that we see the combination of the ochre sandbed and blue wave lines where the sky is reflected. This sky blue, horizon blue color, cerulean. Next I take a smaller brush and I add more maroon, more ultramarine, I add them to the same mix I had used for the foreground. I go in such horizontal lines and do the waves in the middle ground. And I add more ultramarine in the distance. In the reference, we can trace the unusual color of the waves in the middle ground and even in the distance. They're not exactly blue, they're kind of maroon in tone or even terracotta. It's all due to the shadow parts of the waves and the sandbed peeping through. And since the water is shallow, we see the sandbed quite well and the stones underwater too. I apply these horizontal lines evenly across practically the whole surface of the background water. And I use a fan brush for blending. This helps to make the lines smoother in tone. Next, I add more verdite blue to show blue tone in the water in some places. It's kind of mid-tone, something that will unify our lines. And same goes for the foreground, although it's not that visible in the reference. At trained eye will notice these blue lines and that they're present in the foreground too. There is more sky reflected there, so I'm now applying these color relations. The ochre sandbed and the sky reflected in the water. Don't worry that the things unfold this fast. I'm adding more violet and maroon hue, and while the wash is moist, and it's still moist in my case, I start to model the stones. They're peeping through water in the shadow parts, shadow areas where we had shown the dark lines that symbolize the shadow in the waves. Let's remember the exercise on anatomy of water. Actually, we can see the stones in the light parts too, where the water is shallow. When the water is shallow, there can be just light and sky reflection and nothing else to be seen. We also see the sandbed, the stone outlines, they're just more blue in tone. For now, I cover it all with the same mix. I got this mix using my standard way of mixing, ultramarine and orange, plus some Naples yellow or cadmium yellow to add some tones. We can wipe some places like this using a clean brush that I wash first and then dab with a tissue. Note how I do it. I actually have a clean tissue outside the camera's view, so I just wash the brush and you see some tissue even got stuck to the brush. I dab the brush on the tissue and wipe. I needed to show the most prominent part of the wave. Again, note that it's not that well visible in the reference, but when you understand the principles of depicting water, you can intensify some effects on purpose in order to add volume and materiality to your water. If you didn't know these principles, you'd simply copy, but I always support the idea that artists should analyze, know a lot of things, observe a lot, and put it all to practice. I continue to make adjustments and add shadow parts of the stones. We can even add pink hue. I suggest that you act on your color perception. Of course, this complex brown tone can be achieved in many different ways. The more complex a color, the more ways there are to mix it. Since I didn't apply masking fluid to the stones, I now wipe them like this using a clean brush. And I blend it all using a round squirrel brush because my fan brush is too wet and will leave lines. Next, I see that some background waves got blurry again, so I use this blue tone. It's not pure blue though, it's something on my palette. I just add wave strokes and I blend them in such horizontal movements so that they get incorporated into the horizontal shape of the waves. I continue to simultaneously work on the stones in the foreground. I add more Payne's Grey and Ultramarine and I show this outline of the stones. This way the stone at the front kind of steps forward. I go around its light part, showing the shadow parts of the adjacent stones, so to speak. I show the shadow parts, the gaps between the stones. It's all well visible in the reference. I see that the wash is drying here at the edge, so I have to blur with water. Don't be afraid of it. You see I blurred it and it all gets incorporated quite well. I add more red. It can be vermilion or Madder Lake. And I blur it like this. I also use a clean brush dabbed on a tissue to wipe the areas around the glints to lighten these places. Of course, we'll have another method to lighten the halo around the glints after removing masking fluid, but we can also do it at this stage and wipe the paper like this. I use the same method to apply glowing lines on the stones. Light goes through the water column, through the prominent parts of the waves, and these lines appear. We're also familiar with them. They can be done by wiping, but in my case here the wash has dried a little, so I just use a moist brush that contains little water and I paint a line with plain water without using pigment. The water pushes away the nearby colors and these lines appear. And in order to intensify this effect, I go around these areas using a darker pigment and the lines become even more vivid. You see that I wipe and dab the brush on the tissue every time. If it doesn't wipe, I'll remind you again that you can paint these lines using plain water, but you need to monitor the amount of water. I continue to make the colors more complex, adding more warm yellows. It can be cadmium yellow or Naples yellow. Actually, Naples yellow is more preferable here since it's more noble in tone. Next, I want to leave the lines. You can see that I simply go around them using a different color, and these lines appear. I'll slightly blend them in later. I continue to model the shape of the stones, adding more red tone. And I'm working on the stone underwater. It's terracotta in tone. I also want to draw your attention to the fact that every stone has its own tone. Some are more green, others more red or yellow. You can also try and show it in the work. In this work, my method is slightly different from that I used before. I'm not even working from general to specific, and after the first general wash of the local color, I work from piece next. Because I kind of continue the wash and blur the edges and expand it across the whole work. It happens because the first wash has already dried, but I don't want to wait for it to dry completely, so I continue working. And I managed to blur the edges and work on wet. I mean, I wet individual pieces, but using paint rather than plain water. And I add other tones and hues and also blur the sharp edges. More precisely, I don't blur them, I lay other colors there and they kind of get incorporated smoothly, flowing into each other. It's another interesting method, and every time the reference tells me how to work. A useful approach in watercolor is acting as the situation requires. I add more yellow, for example, and we lay it right next to the adjacent dark color. We add more cool tones next to the group of the stones on the left. We can clearly see this blue tone there, and it's also well visible in the reference. We work in pieces like this, and we act fast so that we have time to blend or paint adjacent pieces. Note how I blend it using plain, clean water. So I didn't dry the first wash, I continued working and it dried by itself, and I just continued to work. So the first wash smoothly flowed into the next washes. This method is rather unusual, but it suits perfectly for stone modeling and shallow water. I've mixed this terracotta color. I used Naples yellow and maroon. In the left part of the reference, we can see very interesting complex tones. It's real art. I take pigment very densely. Here watercolor doesn't even look like watercolor anymore. It feels like I'm working with gouache. It gives very opaque strokes. I blur some areas like this, add in more cool tones, and I blur it all with water so that it gets smoothly incorporated. I stretch the wash downwards, I take adjacent colors, and we see that the sharp edge isn't sharp anymore, and it smoothly flows into the nearby stones. I use this method in order to achieve the feeling of stones underwater. They're well visible and the outlines are easily traceable, but we need something to unite them, to immerse them into water. I actually paint these stones as well as the nearby ones, and they smoothly flow into each other. It gives me the needed level of blur, so to speak, the level of softness that lets us feel that the stones are underwater. I intensify mid-tone in some places, in the stones on the right. I add more Naples yellow and horizon blue. It's by Mijello. I'll attach all the hues to the lesson. And here's another stone, very curious and delicate in color. I get this color using the pigments that contain white. Horizon blue and Naples yellow contain some white. So yeah, this work is a little similar to gouache, but it's still watercolor. It flows smoothly. And I feel like adding more maroon here to the stone to separate it and show that it's different in color. And I generalize everything like this. Try it yourselves, I think you'll manage this method. Although it will seem hard at the beginning, it will be okay. I meanwhile continue to stretch the wash. You see I've almost reached the corner, and I'll simply cover what's left with color. It's just leftovers, but I try to avoid using one color anyway. I make sure that I incorporate different colors and add shadows, add hues. Maroon hues, for example, blue, show some irregularities on the stones, the texture, while the wash is moist. So we're doing real art in this work. From the technical point of view, this work is really interesting and thrilling. You see I'm now applying a dark color. It's practically pure Payne's gray with ultramarine and violet. It's because I need the darkest tone. We remember that the darkest spots are usually in the foreground, and the background must be lighter. And I use this generalizing maroon for the shadow. Now I need to blur this all carefully. I intensify the lines in some places. I use a darker color around and they start to glow more. I dab the brush again and wipe the lightest areas on the stones. Like so. We add warm tones in some places and continue. There's this yellowish stone in the foreground. You see I'm adding more Naples yellow. And at the same time, I build the relation of this warm orange stone with the more green one located on the left. I add more horizon blue to it. You could notice that my first wash has fully dried, nothing flows. I could have waited for it to dry completely, the effect would be the same, and we continue to work in pieces, blurring the sharp edges little by little. I see a sharp edge in the distance, I've tried to blur it. We continue to surround the wash by different colors and it gradually blurs and spreads and covers the whole sheet. So we get this multiple colored carpet with pieces that join together and form a true watercolor without hard edges. We still have time to add our glowing lines on the stones. I dab the brush and wipe, and if it doesn't wipe well anymore, you can simply use water, a moist brush, and I apply these lines with water and it pushes the pigment and forms these white lines. So there are two approaches and we can use them both. I try to apply it to all stones, even if they aren't in the reference in some places. But if you feel these lines will enrich your work and add volume, and by the way, they're great for highlighting the shape because they're kind of circle, so they follow the shape. Note that. Remember that the stones are round in shape, and so our lines follow the shape. We're artists and we must feel shapes at all times, understand what we paint, not just copy a flat image and weave a carpet. But we must use our imagination and spatial thinking and imagine what the objects pictured on a flat surface look like in 3D. I constantly use my spatial thinking skills and highlight volume, even if it's not in the reference. I try to think it up and complete it, maybe add something myself too, in order to make the objects more 3D. You need knowledge to do this, of course. That's why we're learning this all together. You see that I'm adding a darker tone around the stone again, and it incorporates into the wash softly. We have just a few things left to complete the stones. But don't hurry, add more hues, don't paint everything in one color. This play of greenish, reddish tones will look great in this work. I wipe some places and blur others. There are a lot of small stones on the left in the reference. We can generalize it all and show just the essential stones. I show the shadows between the stones. That's why pencil drawing matters so much. If it disappeared under the first wash and isn't visible anymore, then maybe you should make it dark next time, so that you can trace things and their location next time. I'm adding these shadows between the stones, and we see that the edge looks quite sharp. I need to blur it now. We can take a white flat brush and go over it, blur it. It's one of the ways, but I do it because it's in the corner of the work and it's not compositional center. So we can generalize it using a white flat brush. I have just a few stones left. This stone on the left is very interesting. It combines both green and red hues. So I take the already familiar mix using Naples yellow and horizon blue for the green and Naples yellow with maroon to add more red to it. Of course, if it all looks too saturated and vivid, make sure you mute this mix using a complementary color. For example, I add ultramarine to orange mixes exactly for this purpose, in order to mute the color a bit so that it loses its saturation and looks more natural. Here color science laws come to our rescue. I try to blur hard edges. In the places where I showed shadows, where I outlined the stones, I add midtones and color the stones inside so that it doesn't look too light. And I go around the wash, incorporating it into the adjacent washes. I'll be making adjustments now, adding some things. I try to wipe, but it doesn't come out right now. Another way of doing a line over an almost dry wash is to wipe a line like this and then dab it with a tissue. Apply a line using water and then dab. The tone must get lighter for sure, but less strongly than if we did it on a fresh, moist wash. I try to eliminate hard edges in some places. We can blend. You can see I use a round squirrel brush to blend and blur, and wipe using a dry brush. You can also wipe using a moist brush, so I actually combine all the methods in order to achieve the desirable result. Watercolor is very flexible. And if you use the same materials, meaning paper and paints, all the time, it becomes quite predictable and your techniques must work. So I paint the lines like this using a moist brush, and I dab the lines with a tissue in order to make some areas lighter. It's not always successful, so consider your particular situation. My goal is to show you as many different techniques as possible. I feel that the background lacks midtones, volume and depth. We can also eliminate the lines like this. They look really beautiful in the reference, notice that. I don't paint the light lines themselves, since we don't have white paint in watercolor. I cover the surrounding area and leave these lines go around them. It's also a great technique. It's called negative space. I try to blend some areas, go over them with a clean, moist brush, so that these lines don't look cut out and hard, but rather have smooth edges. And I continue to intensify like this. If I blurred something too much, I add tone or hue around it, and it starts to glow again. I'm adding more ultramarine and gradually move to the shadow. We see a beautiful blue shadow under the stone on the right. And this reference clearly shows that the reflection and the shadow are two different things. We see that this blue, soft, blurry spot is the shadow from the stones, and the reflections go right under them, and they're darker. I'm now painting the blue shadows. We have just a few strokes left and we'll move on.